In the early morning quiet of a lonely truck stop along Interstate 40, few would guess that danger lurked just around the corner. The Big Tire truck stop was known for its hot coffee, friendly service, and an unspoken respect shared among weary truckers. But this stretch of highway was about to become the backdrop for a confrontation no one saw coming. They arrived on roaring motorcycles, wearing leather vests emblazoned with the mark of the Black Hornets, a ruthless biker gang determined to expand their criminal empire by any means necessary. With few witnesses and fewer rules, the gang figured it would be an easy task to shake down a handful of travelers, a tired waitress, and a quiet, aging Marine veteran who seemed to blend into the background. What they didn't realize was that they had targeted the wrong man. Someone shaped by decades of service, battle-tested in faraway conflicts, and burdened by a steadfast moral code. As tensions escalate and loyalties are tested, a simple truck stop becomes the stage for a life-or-death struggle that will lay bare a much deeper criminal network than anyone ever imagined. Join us now as the story unfolds, plunging headlong into Chapter 1, where an aging Marine named Jack "Gunny" Barnes sits at the counter of a roadside diner, sipping his coffee in peace, unaware of how one fateful encounter will change everything. Quick pause before we continue. Welcome to Fabled Frames. Please tell us where you are watching from. Don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is mind-blowing. The fluorescent lights flickered in the early morning gloom at the Big Tire truck stop off Interstate 40. A handful of rigs idled in the large parking area, engines rumbling against the silence of a day not yet fully awake. Weak sunshine peeked over the horizon, bathing the asphalt in a pale glow. Amid the clamor of a coffee machine whirring behind the counter and the faint hiss of the fry cook's spatula on the grill, an aging Marine veteran named Jack "Gunny" Barnes sat nursing a steaming cup of coffee. Deep lines etched his weathered face, hinting at a lifetime of experiences that ranged from harrowing to heroic. He wore a faded olive-drab field jacket with one or two small tears at the elbows. Beneath it, a simple t-shirt stretched across a torso still lined with muscle. He sipped his coffee in silence, taking measured breaths as the caffeine began to work its magic on his alertness. A few seats away, a pair of burly truckers hunkered over plates of bacon, eggs, and biscuits, occasionally grunting in conversation about freight schedules and deadlines. Gunny recognized the truck stop vibe well. He wasn't a trucker himself, but had spent enough time traveling up and down America's highways to know how these places worked. Most everyone here was just passing through, seeking a brief respite from the endless black ribbon of road. Solitary, tough men and women minding their own business, no fuss, no prying. That's precisely what Gunny liked. No complications, no drama, just a plate of hot food and the hum of anonymity. At this hour, only 3 staff members were on duty. Helen, the veteran waitress who'd served more eggs and coffee than she cared to remember, had a perpetual half-smile and a ready ear for anybody who needed to spill their life story. Tito, the fry cook in the back, rarely spoke more than a few gruff words but made the best hash browns in 3 counties. The third was Carl, a tall, lanky teenager who swept floors and bussed tables in between texting his friends about how he couldn't wait to get out of this dead-end town. All was calm, borderline serene, until the heavy drone of motorcycle engines shattered the early morning peace. 2 bikes pulled into the parking lot, their riders clad in thick leather jackets emblazoned with the insignia of the Black Hornets, a local motorcycle club rumored to be dabbling in extortion, stolen goods, and narcotics distribution. These 2 were named Brick and Deuce, both sporting thick beards, leather gloves, and the swagger of men who believed themselves untouchable. They parked near the entrance, the morning light gleaming off the chrome of their handlebars. Helmetless, Brick ran a hand through his short-cropped hair while Deuce flicked a cigarette butt onto the ground and crushed it under his boot. They surveyed the scene as if they owned it, a sleepy truck stop with minimal witnesses. A perfect environment, Brick mused, to test their brand of intimidation and possibly recruit new stooges or run some sort of hustle. Inside, the bell above the door jingled, prompting Helen to glance up from her station behind the counter. The pair sauntered in, scanning the interior. They immediately spotted Gunny, older and seemingly alone, sipping coffee. They also saw 2 truckers who looked exhausted, a fry cook in the back, and a scrawny busboy. Easy pickings, or so it seemed. The bikers exchanged a knowing look, their eyes lighting with that eager malevolence typical of men who enjoyed throwing their weight around. Brick slid onto a stool 2 seats away from Gunny while Deuce leaned against a vintage pinball machine near the entrance. Gunny continued to sip his coffee, seemingly oblivious to their presence, but every fiber in him bristled with awareness. A sixth sense, honed from a lifetime of vigilance, told him these two spelled trouble. Helen ambled over, greeting them with a polite but wary smile. "Morning, gentlemen. Something to drink?" "We'll take coffee," Brick said. His voice was low and raspy, as though he chewed gravel for breakfast. "Cream or sugar?" "Black," Deuce replied curtly, eyeing the diner like he was sizing up the best angle for intimidation. He spotted a battered old bulletin board near the door that advertised local trucking jobs, roadside help, and free coffee refills for veterans. Deuce rolled his eyes. He'd never served a day in his life, never believed in the system. Helen set down 2 cups and poured steaming coffee, stepping back quickly and giving a nod. The truckers at a far table kept their heads down. They'd seen enough bar fights in their day to suspect something might spark here, but they'd also learned to pick their battles. Brick studied Gunny's profile, noticing the older man's broad shoulders, the proud way he carried himself, and the quiet calm that radiated from him. Something about Gunny put Brick on edge, like staring at a coiled snake that could strike at any moment. But Brick pushed that unease aside and tried to engage in casual small talk laced with implied threats. "Hey, old-timer," he said, leaning slightly in Gunny's direction. "You from around here?" Gunny turned his head slowly, meeting Brick's gaze with the unwavering stare of a man who'd looked into far more dangerous eyes. "No," he said simply. "That's too bad." Brick forced a grin. "We're looking to do a little business along this stretch of the highway, you know? Some extra muscle, maybe? Good money for a man who knows how to keep his mouth shut. You might fit the bill unless, of course, you're just passing through." Gunny set his coffee down, the gentle click of the cup against the saucer sounding like a gunshot in the hush of the diner. He appraised Brick, ignoring Deuce for the moment. He'd seen men of this ilk before, hot-headed bullies who used fear to grease the wheels of their agendas. In an older life, Gunny might have ended the conversation by politely telling them where to go. In the life after the Marine Corps, he'd learned it was best to avoid confrontation unless absolutely necessary. Still, the dog tags under his shirt felt heavier than usual. "I'm not interested," Gunny said, returning his attention to his coffee. Behind them, Deuce let out a half-laugh. "Hey, Brick, I think old man here's used to people telling him what to do. Maybe you're not a skin, right?" Brick's grin turned predatory. He reached over to Gunny's shoulder, tapping it twice. "Don't be so fast to say no, friend. I can guarantee you'll regret passing up an opportunity like this." Gunny could feel each tap like a spark against raw nerves. He glanced at the hand on his shoulder and then up at Brick. The tension was almost palpable, and Helen, sensing trouble, quietly fetched Carl from the back to warn him that something might be brewing. The 2 truckers lifted their eyes from their meals, ready to see if they needed to intervene. Gunny turned fully to face Brick. "Let's not cause a scene here," he said, his voice calm but tinged with an authority that didn't quite match his quiet demeanor. "I'm just having my coffee." For a moment, Brick's bravado faltered. There was steel in Gunny's tone, a latent danger that made every hair on Brick's neck stand on end. But Deuce cleared his throat and stepped closer, providing silent backup. "Yeah?" Brick said. "Scene's already here, old man. You want it or not?" Gunny exhaled, letting the tension ease out of his shoulders. "I'll pass." Brick scoffed, feigning exasperation. "Your funeral, Pops." He withdrew his hand, but there was an unspoken promise in the air that this wasn't the end. Gunny turned back to his coffee, heart rate steady, every bit the composed professional soldier he'd been trained to be decades ago. Meanwhile, Deuce made his way toward the 2 truckers at the back, leaning on the corner of their table. "How's your breakfast?" he asked with mock politeness. They looked up, and one of them, a wiry fellow with a patchy beard, simply said, "Fine." "Good," Deuce replied. "Because we might want a word with you about something that's coming up." "You hauling anything that could use some added security on the road?" "We know ways to keep folks safe." The other trucker, heavier set, said nothing but tightened his grip on his fork. Gunny watched the exchange out of the corner of his eye. Helen seemed visibly nervous. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee for Brick, who was still seated near Gunny. This wasn't the typical morning, and a looming sense of dread crept over everyone present. After a few beats of silence, Deuce returned to Brick. They spoke in hushed tones, likely strategizing how to make their presence felt. Gunny took a final sip of coffee, steeling himself for whatever might follow. The feeling in his gut told him these bikers were more than just petty bullies, they were the advance guard of something bigger. He placed a few bills on the counter to cover his tab, nodded to Helen, and slid off the stool. He saw a flicker of relief in her eyes, as if she were grateful he hadn't escalated the situation. He clutched his duffel bag, which contained few possessions but many memories, and turned toward the exit. Brick spoke up again. "Leaving so soon, old man? You don't want to talk business?" Gunny didn't break stride. "Some other time." He felt their eyes on him every step to the door. As he pushed it open, a gust of early morning wind hit his face. The parking lot outside was quiet but for the hum of idling trucks, and the two motorcycles gleamed ominously just a few feet away. Gunny's battered black pickup truck stood at the far side of the lot, near the diesel pumps. He glanced back over his shoulder through the diner's glass window. Brick and Deuce were conferring with each other, their faces creased with malice. The younger men's ambitions were evident. They saw the truck stop as easy territory, a microcosm of potential victims and maybe even new recruits. Gunny knew men like them rarely let go of a perceived slight. As Gunny reached his truck and turned the ignition, he felt an ominous chill. He knew in his bones that he hadn't seen the last of these bikers. Their kind of ambition was like a growing cancer, and eventually he would be forced into a confrontation he had hoped to avoid. The key turned and the engine roared to life. In the side mirror, he caught a final glimpse of Brick and Deuce stepping out of the diner, eyes trained directly on him. Would they follow him? Or would the trouble they'd planned for the truck stop take an even darker turn? For the moment, Gunny pulled out onto the ramp leading back to Interstate 40, uncertain where this unwelcome thread in his life was about to lead. Some half-dozen miles down Interstate 40, Gunny's mind churned with unsettling thoughts. A part of him wanted to ignore these bikers, to leave them in the past the way he'd left behind so much else when he was discharged from the Corps. But another part of him, the old Marine in him, burned with the knowledge that people like Brick and Deuce thrived on the apathy of others. If no one stood up, their intimidation and violence would flourish. To calm his nerves, Gunny flicked on the radio. Johnny Cash crooned about heartbreak and hardship. Fitting, Gunny thought. The gentle rumble of tires on asphalt provided a backbeat, but even the music couldn't entirely settle his mind. He'd spent years honing instincts that told him when something was amiss. Right now, those instincts were screaming. He recalled an old buddy, Larry Scotch O'Neill, who ran a mechanics shop not far from here. The two had surfed together in Beirut back in the early 80s. Maybe Gunny could stop by and say hello, decompress. But the memory of Brick's leering face and Deuce's mocking smile kept replaying. He wondered if they were tailing him, so he checked his rearview mirror repeatedly, scanning the highway for motorcycles. The road behind him was empty, just an occasional long-haul truck, no sign of the Black Hornets. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to blow. Meanwhile, back at the big tire truck stop, Brick and Deuce stepped outside, still discussing their next move. The conversation was clipped, each man talking in hushed tones. "You see the way that old Coot looked at us?" Deuce said, lighting a new cigarette. He wasn't scared. Brick scowled. "He'll regret that soon enough. I want to expand our reach down this stretch of highway. More stops, more influence, more money." Deuce took a drag, exhaling twin plumes of smoke from his nostrils. "We just gotta show who's boss, make an example of somebody." Their eyes wandered over to the pair of truckers now leaving the diner, heading to their rigs. Brick took a step forward, but Deuce laid a restraining hand on his arm. "Not yet," Deuce murmured. "We gotta be smart about it." Brick nodded. They strolled back inside, ignoring Helen's anxious gaze. She asked if they wanted refills on coffee, but they waved her off. Instead, they focused on the scattered handful of customers. Deuce sized up the older trucker in the corner who was finishing his meal. The man averted his gaze, hurriedly paid, and left. Fear was thick in the air, exactly how Brick and Deuce preferred it. In a far booth, they finally spotted a more vulnerable-looking target. A lone trucker with a cast on his right arm, likely healing from a fracture. He had the misfortune of being pinned down by his own limited mobility. Brick and Deuce slid into the booth across from him without even asking. "Hey, friend," Brick began with a toothy smile. "We hear you might be in need of some extra security on the road. Dangerous place out there." The trucker swallowed hard, eyes flicking to the diner's entrance. He was clearly out of his depth. I'm not looking for trouble," he stammered. "Neither are we," Deuce said, lying through his teeth. "We just want to help. Maybe you slip us a fee and we make sure no one messes with your rig. Could be real valuable, especially with that arm of yours." The trucker hesitated, fear shining in his eyes. He finally fumbled for his wallet. How much?" Brick grinned. "We'll start small. 100 for this trip. Then we'll see where it goes." Helen watched the entire exchange from the counter, her stomach tied in knots. She knew she should call the local police, but these men, these Black Hornets, had a reputation. She also knew the nearest station was in the next county, and response times on the interstate were abysmal. Unsure of what to do, she held her tongue, hoping the ordeal would end without bloodshed. At that exact moment, on I-40, Gunny's truck rumbled over a small bridge crossing a shallow river. The reflection of the sun on the water danced across his windshield. He felt torn. He just wanted to be left alone, to live out his remaining years in relative peace. But a moral quandary gnawed at him. Could he really drive away knowing that two predators were roaming free, ready to victimize anyone in their path? He thought about the truck stop staff, old, kind Helen, the shy busboy Carl, and even the no-nonsense Fry Cook Tito. They didn't deserve to be harassed. Neither did the truckers, who were just out here trying to make a living. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his mind drifting to memories of firefights abroad. He remembered the weight of a rifle in his hands, the way the adrenaline sang in his veins, and the moral clarity that came with defending others. Pulling into the next rest area, Gunny parked his truck. The sky was now a clear, brilliant blue, sunlight making long shadows on the concrete. He got out to stretch his legs, shutting the door behind him with a resolute thud. Perhaps he should contact the authorities, maybe that was the right approach. But he'd learned long ago that men like Brick and Deuce could weasel out of simple assault charges, that the wheels of justice often turned too slowly to prevent further harm. He recalled the story of a friend from his military days who'd had a run-in with a gang. The friend cooperated with the cops, only to find that the gang members got out on bail the next day and continued terrorizing the neighborhood. That cynicism about the system now warred against his sense of responsibility. Gunny ran a hand over his short-cropped, graying hair. "Damn it," he muttered to himself, climbing back into the driver's seat. A decision had crystallized in his mind. He'd take matters into his own hands if he had to. He turned the key, the engine ignited. As he merged back onto the highway, he knew exactly where he was headed, Larry Scotch O'Neill's auto shop. If anyone could help him find the best way to handle this, it was Larry. They'd faced more than one firefight in their youth, and Larry still had connections in town. Would Gunny's decision to seek out his old friend place a target on both their backs? And what of the truck stop, now squarely in Brick and Deuce's crosshairs? As the miles slipped by, Gunny felt a flicker of dread that perhaps, by choosing to get involved, he was reopening a door to a part of himself he tried so hard to leave behind. Larry Scotch O'Neill's shop was set on a sloping patch of land just off a rural highway, surrounded by tall pines and the ever-present smell of gasoline. Rusted cars and old tires were scattered around a wide dirt lot, awaiting salvage or repair. An American flag fluttered on a pole near the shop's entrance, a testament to Larry's continued patriotism despite the years. Gunny pulled in, parking near a dilapidated RV. He stepped out and instantly heard the clang of metal on metal and a steady hum of country rock streaming from a dusty radio inside the shop. "Scotch," Gunny called, entering through the open garage door. Larry emerged from beneath a classic Chevy, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a mustache that had gone gray around the edges. Lines creased his face, and an old scar ran from his temple to his jaw, a reminder of a roadside bomb they'd both survived decades ago. His eyes lit up when he recognized Gunny. "Well, I'll be damned," Larry said, a genuine grin splitting his face. He tossed the rag aside, walked over, and clapped Gunny on the shoulder. "Long time, brother." They shook hands, and Larry pulled him into a gruff hug. "Didn't expect to see you down this neck of the woods," Larry said, stepping back. "Last I heard, you were bouncing around from state to state, doing odd jobs." Gunny nodded. "Still doing that. But I had a run-in this morning that brought me here." He He paused, eyeing the interior of the shop, a mishmash of half-fixed cars and an office space cluttered with old marine memorabilia. "How's business?" "Up and down, same as always. Locals sometimes pay me in barter instead of cash, but I ain't complaining. Gets me by." Larry pointed to a mini-fridge in the corner. "Got a cold beer if you want one." Gunny glanced at the clock on the wall. "It's not even noon," he said with a hint of a smile. Larry shrugged. "We're not getting any younger, Gunny. Besides, it's 5 o'clock somewhere, right?" Gunny chuckled and accepted a bottle, twisting off the cap. He took a long gulp, letting the crisp liquid wash away the dryness in his throat. For a moment, it felt like old times, two Marines sharing a drink and a laugh, far removed from the tragedies they'd witnessed. But the fleeting nostalgia ended when Gunny remembered the reason he'd come. "So," he began, leaning against a battered tool bench, "I ran into a couple of real pieces of work at a truck stop off I-40. A pair of bikers, Black Hornets." Larry's brow furrowed at the mention of the gang. "Yeah, I've heard about them. They've been flexing their muscles lately, trying to get a foothold in extortion and worse." "You have words?" Gunny nodded, recounting the morning's events in detail, the quiet coffee, the menacing duo, and the intimidation. Larry listened intently, occasionally spitting curses under his breath. "Their trouble, all right," Larry said once Gunny finished. "You thinking of stepping in?" Gunny pressed the cold beer bottle to his forehead, letting out a low sigh. "I don't like bullies, never did. They were messing with folks just trying to make a living. I can't let that slide." Larry crossed his arms. "You sure you want to do this? I know you still carry those ghosts. And these guys might not back down easily." Gunny's gaze hardened. "I've lived my whole life facing bullies in one form or another. Don't see a reason to stop now." For a moment, Larry said nothing. Then he walked over to the office space and rummaged in a desk drawer, eventually pulling out a worn leather folder. He opened it, revealing a small arsenal of legal papers, old service commendations, and newspaper clippings about local crimes. "I've been tracking some of their activities," Larry admitted. "Nothing official, just neighborhood watch-type stuff. Local cops are slow, underfunded. But from what I hear, the Black Hornets have a main clubhouse further west, near the county line. They do some business out of a bar called River's Edge." Gunny recognized the name. He'd driven by it once or twice, a dingy place on a lonely stretch of road overlooking a murky river. "You think they're moving out this way, or just passing through?" Larry shook his head. "They're setting up. Got some new leadership who wants to expand. Extortion is easy money, but rumor is they're looking to push meth, maybe heavier stuff. Once they dig in, it's hard to root them out." Gunny took another swig of beer, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. "I'm not a one-man police force, Scotch." Larry grunted. "Neither am I. But maybe together we can do something, or at least protect folks. If you're serious about this, I can make some calls." Gunny set the beer down. His mind flashed to the images of the truck stop, Helen's uneasy smile, the trucker's timid posture, and the smug grins on Brick and Deuce. "Yeah," he said at length. "I'm serious." While Gunny and Larry strategized, back at the truck stop, Brick and Deuce had continued their intimidation campaign. The trucker with the broken arm paid the $100, and with that success in hand, the duo realized just how easy it would be to extort money from the passing crowd. After collecting their ill-gotten fee, they swaggered into the parking lot, scanning for other opportunities. The early morning hush had lifted, more travelers were pulling in for breakfast or fuel. A minivan with a family of 4. A lone motorcyclist on a cross-country trip. A short-haul truck driver delivering crates of produce. "Look at all these fresh pigeons," Deuce said, licking his lips. Brick nodded, but his mind drifted to Gunny. The old man had not shown fear, and that rankled Brick. He wondered if maybe Gunny was some ex-cop or ex-military tough guy. The possibility unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Forget him," Deuce finally muttered. "We got bigger fish to fry." Brick agreed, at least outwardly. Yet a tiny spark of pride ignited inside him, a challenge he couldn't ignore. He wanted to find that old man again, to prove who was the bigger alpha. The notion that some random geriatric could stand up to him chafed at his image as a hardened biker. They spent the next hour hovering around the parking lot, strong-arming anyone who looked weak, or at least pliable. They made small talk with the gas station attendant, letting him know they expected cooperation. The attendant only nodded, eyes wide with worry. Helen caught glimpses of their activities through the diner windows. Her stomach twisted in knots at each sight. She felt powerless and feared the worst, a robbery, a beating, or something far more tragic. Tito, the fry cook, busied himself in the kitchen, occasionally peering out to see if he was needed. Carl, meanwhile, had simply vanished, possibly hiding in the back storage room, too frightened to even appear. All the while, a sense of creeping dread enveloped the truck stop. The travelers, oblivious to local troubles, might walk into a nightmare at any moment. Brick and Deuce reveled in their ability to spread fear, but they had bigger plans. They wanted to bring more members of their gang to secure the spot. "That cafe in there," Brick said, nodding toward the diner. "That waitress, the fry cook, they'll be paying tribute soon enough. A cut of their profits just for letting them operate in our territory." Deuce smirked. "Think they'll fight back?" Brick shrugged. "They can try. We'll just push harder." Unbeknownst to the duo, Gunny was in a nearby town hatching a plan with an old brother in arms. The seeds of trouble had been planted, but a storm was gathering on the horizon, one that could either uproot the Black Hornets or lead to a deadly confrontation. Back in Larry's office, the two veterans leaned over a cluttered wooden desk illuminated by a single fluorescent lamp. The edges of the desk were marred by deep grooves and scratches, a testament to years of tough work and half-abandoned projects. Strewn across its surface were newspaper clippings and a map of the county with several red pins stuck into various towns and highway off-ramps. "The main clubhouse is here," Larry said, tapping a spot on the map about 20 miles west of the truck stop. "But they've also been seen in these smaller towns picking fights, running rackets." Gunny studied the map, arms folded. "So they're spreading out along the interstate corridors." "Yup. Makes sense. Truckers, travelers, they're easy pickings if you can maintain an aura of fear." Gunny sighed. The fight seemed bigger than he initially realized. "If they're this organized, the local cops have to know, right?" Larry blew out a breath. "They know. But they don't have the resources to go up against a well-armed gang. Plus, some of these small-town cops could be on the take. It's not exactly a secret that the Hornets have bought off officials in the past." Gunny's jaw tightened. He was no stranger to corruption. He'd seen it overseas and stateside. "What's our play here?" Larry scratched his chin. "We get word out to folks. Don't pay, don't fold. The more the Hornets realize they can't extort easily, the more they might back down. Then again, that could also provoke them to escalate. Hard to say." Gunny considered the best approach. The direct route, going to the truck stop and physically confronting Brick and Deuce, could lead to a firefight, endangering innocent bystanders. A stealth approach, gathering intel and sabotaging the gang's operations, was another option, but it would take time and resources they might not have. "Any chance we can cut the head off the snake?" Gunny asked, tapping the location of the clubhouse. "Possibly," Larry replied with a grim set to his mouth. "But that's a fortress. My guess is they have at least a dozen guys there. Armed and mean." Gunny stroked the stubble on his chin. "Then we might need to be strategic. Maybe start with these two punks, show them they can't just walk into a truck stop and take over." Larry's eyes flashed with concern. "Careful, brother. You know once you confront them, the rest will come looking." Gunny's stare hardened. "Let them. People need to see that these thugs can be stood up to." They spent the next hour hammering out details, possible safe houses, whom they could trust, and how best to contact the local law enforcement that hadn't been compromised. Larry made a few phone calls to old friends, reservists, and even a couple of retired cops who might lend a hand if things got dire. Meanwhile, Gunny started making a mental list of equipment they might need, non-lethal options like stun guns or pepper spray if it came to that, plus a contingency plan to arm themselves legally. As a Marine veteran, he understood the line between defending the innocent and becoming vigilantes was razor-thin. As the discussion wore on, a low rumble of thunder echoed outside. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, mirroring the tension building in Gunny's gut. Later that afternoon, the two men went outside and Larry unlocked a small storage shed behind the garage. Inside were shelves crammed with old engine parts, half-empty paint cans, and stacks of military gear in battered footlockers. "I've been collecting stuff over the years," Larry explained, popping open the latch on one locker. Inside lay a disassembled AR-15, perfectly cleaned and oiled, alongside boxes of ammo. "Just in case." Gunny hunkered down, running his hands over the metal. Memories flooded back, the weight of an M16 in Beirut, the crack of rifle fire in the desert. He'd never forgotten how to strip and clean a weapon. It was muscle memory at this point. "We can't go in guns blazing," Gunny warned. "Not yet anyway. But this is good to have if they force our hand." Larry nodded and closed the locker, securing it. "Agreed. Gotta be surgical about this." Meanwhile, back at the big tire truck stop, dusk settled in. A neon sign flickered, casting pink and blue reflections on the wet pavement, and afternoon rain had passed, leaving the air thick with humidity. Inside the diner, Helen mopped the floors while Carl stacked chairs in the corner, preparing to close. The day had been tense, with Brick and Deuce hovering around like vultures, but eventually they'd left. Their parting words to Helen were a thinly veiled threat: "We'll be back to talk business." She shuddered at the memory, locking the front door and flipping the sign to closed. The last thing she wanted was for them to return. She hoped, maybe naively, that they'd move on to some other part of the highway. While the diner closed under an uneasy lull, Gunny and Larry prepared for a confrontation that could erupt at any time. The question loomed: would they be able to outmaneuver a gang determined to tighten its grip on the region, or had Gunny unwittingly placed a target on everyone he cared about? Rain pelted the roof of Larry's auto shop throughout the night, creating a steady drip that lulled the small office into a tense vigil. Gunny and Larry took turns nodding off in a pair of old chairs, their eyes drifting over the phone, half expecting a call that something terrible had happened. In the pale light of early dawn, the downpour eased. Gunny rubbed his face, rousing himself from a restless doze. Larry was already awake, sipping black coffee. A new day had come, and with it, the pressure to make their next move. "We should pay a visit to that truck stop," Gunny said, standing and stretching out the kinks in his back. "Make sure everything's okay. Give them a heads up about what we know." Larry nodded. "Agreed. But let's go quiet. Don't want a big scene." They loaded into Gunny's truck. Larry's ride was an old muscle car that guzzled gas and drew too much attention. Gunny preferred subtlety, especially after the events of the previous day. They rolled out onto the wet asphalt, the sun just beginning to break through thick gray clouds, casting a dull morning light over the countryside. 40 minutes later, they approached the big tire truck stop. It stood like a solitary beacon off the interstate, giant neon sign advertising clean showers and good eats. The parking lot was partially filled with big rigs, each driver likely hurrying to log a few more miles before taking a break. Gunny parked near the entrance. At a glance, everything seemed normal, no motorcycles or menacing figures in sight. But he stayed alert. The calm might only be temporary. They entered the diner and found Helen at her usual post behind the counter, taking an order from a travel-weary couple. The waitress brightened upon seeing Gunny, though the worry lines around her eyes remained. "Well, good morning," she said, handing 2 menus to Larry and Gunny. "You come back to give me a heart attack?" Gunny smiled gently. "Just wanted some breakfast. And to check on you." Helen pursed her lips. "It's been quiet so far, but I'm not holding my breath." "Those 2 from yesterday, who were they?" Gunny slid onto a stool with Larry doing the same beside him. "Outlaws," he answered plainly. "Probably part of a bigger group. I'm concerned they might try to shake this place down." Helen's face paled. She glanced at the few patrons in the diner. Some were eavesdropping. "I can't afford that," she murmured. "Most of our profit goes back into keeping the doors open." Larry placed a reassuring hand on the counter. "We're here to help, ma'am. At least, we'll do what we can." Just then, the bell above the door jingled. In walked a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a rumpled sheriff's deputy uniform. He removed his hat and ambled over to the counter, nodding politely. Helen offered him a tired smile. "Morning, Deputy Carson." "Usual coffee." "Please," Carson replied, eyeing Gunny and Larry. "Don't think I've seen you 2 around here before." Gunny extended a hand. "Name's Jack Barnes, friends call me Gunny. This is Larry O'Neill." Carson shook hands, then sat a few stools down. "You local?" "No, just passing through," Gunny said, trying not to appear suspicious. "We heard some trouble might be brewing here." Carson's gaze sharpened. "I've heard rumors. Biker gang harassing folks. We've had a couple calls, but by the time we roll out, they're gone." Helen refilled Carson's coffee. "Deputy, I'm worried they'll come back. Yesterday, they tried to scare some of the truckers." The deputy took a thoughtful sip. "Well, ma'am, we'll do our best to keep an eye on things. But we're short-staffed. and they like to pop in quick, cause trouble, then vanish. Gunny noted the frustration in Carson's voice. This was a man trapped by limited resources and a wide jurisdiction. Is there anything we can do to help? Maybe a local neighborhood watch or something? Carson shrugged. We don't encourage vigilantism, but it wouldn't hurt if folks kept each other informed. If you see something, give us a call right away. Gunny and Larry exchanged a glance, silently acknowledging that an official response might be too little, too late. Still, they thanked Carson for his time. After breakfast, Gunny and Larry stepped outside to check the lot. The day had grown warmer, the sky clearing. Truckers bustled around their rigs, fueling up. As they headed back to Gunny's pickup, a nervous-looking truck driver approached them. He was thin, hunched, with darting eyes that screamed worry. "Excuse me, I overheard you inside talking about those bikers." Gunny and Larry paused. "We're listening," Larry said. The driver wiped sweat from his brow. They approached me a few days ago. Demanded I pay protection. I told them I had no cash to spare, just enough for gas. One of them threatened to slash my tires. I got out of there quick, but now I'm afraid to come back." Gunny nodded sympathetically. "They mentioned where you could find them if you changed your mind?" The driver shook his head. "Just said they'd be around. That if I didn't pay up next time, I'd regret it." Larry crossed his arms. "What's your route?" "Lately, up and down 40, delivering produce. I can't avoid this road. It's my livelihood." Gunny placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "We'll do what we can. In the meantime, if you see those bikers, call the sheriff immediately. Don't confront them alone." The driver nodded, relief flickering in his eyes, though overshadowed by lingering fear. He headed back to his rig, leaving Gunny and Larry alone in the parking lot. Larry rubbed his neck, tension building. "This is worse than I thought. Word spreading among truckers that these guys are bad news." "Then we need to escalate our own plan," Gunny said decisively. They climbed into the pickup, uncertain what form that escalation would take, yet certain they had to do something. As Gunny drove away, neither he nor Larry noticed a solitary motorcycle parked discreetly behind a neighboring building. A figure watched them through tinted goggles, engine idling quietly. The Black Hornets were already one step ahead, their surveillance network extending where Gunny least expected. A few miles away from the truck stop, in a dilapidated warehouse near a junkyard, Brick and Deuce convened with a handful of fellow Black Hornets. The gang's makeshift hideout was littered with old furniture, flickering fluorescent lights, and the pungent odor of cigarettes and stale beer. A battered wooden table took center stage, covered in maps, scribbled notes, and the remnants of fast food wrappers. Standing around it were 4 more men wearing the gang's signature leather vests. Reaper, a tall, tattooed man with sunken cheeks, was the acting leader of the small cell. Next to him stood Knox, a broad-shouldered brute who rarely spoke but fought like a rabid animal when provoked. Brick relayed the story of their truck stop visit. "We got some traction, couple of truckers paid up, no fuss. But there was an old Marine we tried to recruit. He shot us down." Reaper frowned. "One man? That's messing with your head? You're slipping, Brick." Brick's jaw tightened. He had a vibe about him. Military. Knew how to stand his ground. Deuce chimed in. "I think he's trouble, boss. We did a quick check around town. Folks said some older fellow was asking questions about us. He's not just passing through." Reaper exhaled slowly. "Then we deal with him. We can't let some vigilante get in our way. You two take Knox and do a sweep. If he's poking around that truck stop again or anywhere else, convince him to stop." Brick and Deuce exchanged grim looks. This was the green light to escalate. They knew how violent Knox could get. It wouldn't be subtle. But if that was the cost of securing their territory, so be it. Later that afternoon, Gunny and Larry were back at the auto shop, fine-tuning their strategy. Larry had reached out to a retired state trooper named Ed Morales, who'd agreed to keep an ear to the ground for any unusual activity on the local radio frequencies. They decided to do a test run at the truck stop, station themselves discreetly, see if the bikers arrived, and document any illegal activity with a camera. The hope was to gather enough evidence to force the sheriff's hand or present a compelling case to the feds. As dusk settled, Gunny's truck rumbled back onto I-40. The atmosphere was tense in the cab. Larry fiddled with a pair of binoculars while Gunny checked the digital camera battery. They put a small toolbox in the back seat containing zip ties, a flashlight, duct tape, and a first aid kit. A single sidearm lay hidden within a lockbox, legal to carry but only for dire emergencies. They arrived at the truck stop under a swath of purplish-orange sky, parking inconspicuously among the semis. Gunny and Larry split up. Larry went into the diner posing as a customer while Gunny hung near the gas pumps, pretending to check his tires. The plan was simple: watch, wait, and record. Half an hour passed and nothing happened. The occasional traveler strolled by. A family in an SUV pulled in for a snack. A handful of truckers topped off their tanks and rolled on. Larry texted from inside, "So far, so good." Gunny wandered around the perimeter of the lot, feigning casual interest. He snapped a couple of photos of the area for reference, maybe to note vantage points. The sun dipped lower, bathing everything in a dim glow. Suddenly, he heard it, the distinct roar of motorcycles. Instinctively, Gunny shrank behind a parked rig. From around the corner, 3 bikes rolled into view, headlamps cutting swaths of light across the asphalt. It was Brick, Deuce, and a massive, hulking figure Gunny had never seen before, Knox. Gunny fished out the camera, zooming in. He caught a series of photos as the trio circled the parking lot. Knox had a face like chiseled stone, with scars visible even from a distance. Gunny watched them dismount and remove their helmets, scanning the area with predatory interest. From inside the diner, Larry spotted them too. He hastily paid for a cup of coffee and pretended to walk toward the restroom. Once out of sight, he slipped out a side door that led toward the dumpsters, stepping quietly around the building to get a better look. Knox, Brick, and Deuce fanned out. Gunny guessed they were looking for him or possibly any trucker who seemed easy to lean on. Deuce cornered a driver pumping fuel while Brick made for the diner's entrance. Knox hung back, arms folded like twin sledgehammers, scanning every face in view. Gunny raised the camera again, capturing Deuce approaching the driver. Through the lens, he saw Deuce lean in, likely demanding money. The driver shook his head, eyes wide with fear. Deuce jerked a thumb at the rig's tires, a threat that didn't need words. Gunny's blood simmered. Before he could decide whether to intervene, a sudden crash echoed from the other side of the diner like a trash can being kicked over. He heard an angry shout and recognized Larry's voice. Gunny dashed across the lot, camera forgotten in his haste. Rounding the corner of the diner, he found Larry grappling with Brick, who had apparently come around back to see if anyone was hiding there. A toppled metal trash bin spilled refuse across the pavement. Knox was moving in fast, heavy boots pounding the ground. Deuce, alerted by the commotion, left the trucker and ran toward the scuffle. Gunny realized they were outnumbered 3-2, with at least one opponent built like a freight train. Larry managed to land a punch on Brick's jaw, snapping his head back. But Brick recovered quickly, bringing a knee into Larry's abdomen. Larry staggered, winded. Gunny didn't hesitate. With a fluid motion that belied his age, he hooked one arm around Brick's neck and yanked him backward, choking off whatever punch Brick was about to throw. Brick's eyes bulged in shock. Deuce lunged at Gunny, but Larry intercepted him, tackling Deuce to the ground. The 2 men wrestled on the asphalt, exchanging blows. Deuce managed to smash an elbow into Larry's nose, drawing blood. Knox arrived last, zeroing in on Gunny, who still had Brick in a chokehold. The giant balled his fists, each resembling a wrecking ball. Gunny saw him coming and released Brick, pivoting just in time to dodge a massive punch. The blow glanced off Gunny's shoulder, sending a white-hot flare of pain across his back. Gunny grimaced but kept his footing. He jabbed Knox in the ribs, finding little give in the man's rock-hard torso. Knox smirked as if amused that Gunny was trying to hurt him. He responded with a backhand swing that slammed Gunny into the side of the dumpster. Gunny's vision blurred for a moment, the world spinning. Larry, still grappling with Deuce, managed to get on top and land a solid punch on the biker's temple. Deuce's head snapped to the side and he went limp. For a brief second, Larry felt a surge of triumph until Brick ambushed him from behind, hooking Larry's legs and toppling him to the ground. Back at the dumpster, Gunny forced himself upright. Knox advanced, fists raised. Gunny feinted a punch at Knox's head but instead aimed a swift kick at the man's knee. Knox howled in pain, dropping to one knee but only momentarily. The hulking biker rose almost instantly, adrenaline clearly fueling him. Gunny narrowly dodged another haymaker, rolling to the side. Knox's fist punched a dent into the dumpster, demonstrating the raw power behind his blow. Gunny scrambled to his feet, ignoring the throbbing in his ribs. Over by the building, Brick pinned Larry to the ground, pressing a forearm against Larry's throat. Larry choked, face reddening. Knowing time was running out, Gunny made a risky decision. He let Knox swing first. As Knox lunged, Gunny sidestepped and used the man's momentum to redirect him headfirst into the dumpster. The resounding clang echoed through the night. Knox slumped, momentarily dazed. Gunny bolted over to help Larry. Brick, sensing Gunny's approach, released Larry and spun around. It was too late. Gunny tackled Brick at waist level, sending both men sprawling. Larry coughed, regaining his breath. But the fight was far from over. Deuce regained consciousness, shaking off the dizziness. He staggered to his feet, spotting Gunny grappling with Brick. He pulled a switchblade from his jacket pocket. Larry saw the glint of steel under the flickering parking lot light. With a burst of protective fury, he launched himself at Deuce, slamming the biker against the wall. The blade clattered to the ground. Deuce gasped, all the air forced from his lungs. Gunny, pinned under Brick's weight, elbowed the biker's ribs repeatedly. Brick grunted, his punches losing power with each well-placed jab. Finally, Gunny twisted free, hooking his leg around Brick's and rolling him into a chokehold. For a heartbeat, the scuffle froze in time. Gunny had Brick in a hold, Larry had Deuce pinned, and Knox was dazed by the dumpster. Then a flash of blue and red lights washed over the scene, sirens blaring. Someone had called the cops. Gunny and Larry exchanged a worried glance. The last thing they wanted was to be arrested for assault, but at least the arrival of law enforcement might break up the brawl. They released the bikers, stepping back with hands raised. As the patrol cars screeched to a halt, uniformed officers leapt out, weapons drawn, uncertain who the aggressors were in this chaotic scene. Gunny felt blood trickling down the side of his face. Brick and Deuce, battered and livid, glared daggers at him while Knox struggled to stand. The stage was set for a standoff that could bring the simmering conflict to a boil and possibly lead to repercussions far beyond a single fistfight behind a diner. 2 county sheriff patrol cars and a state trooper cruiser formed a blockade of swirling lights. Deputies spilled out, shouting at everyone to get down, freeze, or keep their hands visible. The tension crackled in the air, magnified by adrenaline and the pain throbbing through the fighters' bodies. Gunny and Larry slowly raised their hands, stepping back from the groaning bikers. Deuce, half-stunned, lay panting on the ground. Brick and Knox pulled themselves upright, glaring defiantly at the officers. Deputy Carson was among the responders. He recognized Gunny and Larry from the diner and quickly moved to separate them from the bikers. "Everybody calm down," Carson barked, gesturing for the other deputies to keep their distance. One deputy cuffed Brick, who resisted by yanking his arm away. Another officer leveled a taser at him, prompting Brick to finally relent. Knox, still dazed, muttered curses under his breath. Deuce rubbed a swollen jaw and spat blood onto the pavement. Carson approached Gunny. "What the hell happened here?" Gunny's breathing was ragged, but he tried to stay calm. "They attacked us. We were just trying to defend ourselves." One of the other deputies eyed the battered dumpster, the splattered trash, and the scattered footprints. It certainly looked like a violent brawl. But who started it was less clear. Carson scrutinized the bikers' vests, noticing the Black Hornets insignia. He frowned, turning back to Gunny and Larry. "These guys have a reputation. You're telling me they jumped you?" Larry wiped blood from his split lip. "We were trying to gather evidence. We suspected they'd come back. They spotted me behind the diner, and it escalated." Carson studied them both, clearly torn between procedure and trust. He glanced at the other deputies, some of whom were already reading Brick and Deuce their rights. Knox stood stoically, a cut above his right eye slowly oozing blood. Finally, Carson shook his head. "I have to bring everyone down to the station. At least for questioning. This is too big a mess to sort out here." Gunny sighed, shoulders sagging. "All right, we'll comply." Larry grumbled but nodded. "We've got nothing to hide." The next hour was a blur of being patted down, placed in separate squad cars, and hauled to the local sheriff's department. Gunny felt a mix of frustration and relief that at least the bikers weren't free to hurt anyone else tonight, and frustration that the justice system might just let them walk in the morning. At the station, they were booked and placed in holding cells for questioning. Larry was fuming, pacing back and forth in their shared cell. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he muttered. "We try to help, and now we're wearing handcuffs." Gunny sat on a cold metal bench, looking more introspective than angry. At least this might get the sheriff to finally pay attention to the threat these guys pose. Larry snorted. Or it'll get us locked up while they walk free. Meanwhile, in a separate holding cell, Brick, Deuce, and Knox nursed their wounds. Brick glared at the barred door, fists clenched. Deuce leaned against a wall, dabbing at a bloody nose with a wad of toilet paper. Knox simply sat on the bench, staring at the floor. Can't believe those old men got the jump on us, Brick growled. But we'll get the last laugh. Knox didn't respond. Deuce mumbled, soon as we're out of here, I say we bring more of the club down on that truck stop. Make an example of it. Brick nodded in agreement, eyes alight with vengeful glee. Yeah, and that old Marine is gonna regret ever messing with the Black Hornets. A few hours later, Deputy Carson fetched Gunny and Larry from their cell, taking them to an interrogation room. These guys off our backs. Parker rubbed his jaw. Normally, I wouldn't agree to that, but I've seen gangs ruin communities before. I'm in, at least for a trial run. With Parker's help, they formulated a plan. Increased truck stop presence. Parker would station one of his men discreetly at the diner, armed and ready. Mobile surveillance. Another team member would patrol the nearby roads in an unmarked SUV, scanning for bikers en route. Rapid response. Gunny and Larry would coordinate with the sheriff if a major confrontation seemed imminent, hoping that official backup would arrive faster than before. It wasn't foolproof, but it was a start. As they concluded their meeting, Gunny's phone buzzed with a message from Helen. They're back. A group of bikers just arrived, about 5 or 6, asking for you. Gunny showed the text to Parker and Larry. Their eyes met in grim understanding. Time had run out. The Black Hornets were making their next move, and it would take all their combined resolve to keep the truck stop from turning into a battlefield. Gunny, Larry, and Parker's 2 associates loaded into a pair of vehicles, hearts pounding with anticipation. Parker stayed behind for a moment, issuing final instructions via radio to his surveillance driver, who had already taken position near the interstate. Then he joined them, sliding behind the wheel of the SUV with practiced calm. They sped down the highway, the morning sun glaring across their windshields. The radio crackled with a terse report. I count 7 bikes, heading east at high speed. They're about 2 miles from the truck stop. Understood, Parker replied. Maintain distance. We'll rendezvous in the parking lot. Gunny gritted his teeth, recalling that last text from Helen. She sounded terrified, understandably so. If the Hornets were already there, they might be strong-arming customers or staff. Within minutes, they careened into the truck stop parking lot. Gunny's pickup swerved to a halt near the diner's entrance, while Parker's SUV pulled in behind a row of parked semis to keep out of direct sight. A cluster of motorcycles stood near the pumps. 3 bikers loitered by the bikes, arms crossed, while 2 more seemed to have gone inside. Gunny immediately recognized Brick's black leather vest and Deuce's distinctive bandana. Knox was nowhere in sight, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. Gunny hopped out of his truck, scanning the area. Larry followed, staying behind him, and Parker's 2 associates moved in a flanking position. One was a lean man with sharp features named Torres, the other a stocky ex-Marine called Dowd. Each carried concealed sidearms, though they kept their hands away from the holsters for now. Brick's gaze snapped to Gunny, and a predatory grin split his face. Deuce flicked a cigarette but onto the pavement. About time you showed up, old man. We were starting to think you'd run off. Gunny didn't rise to the bait. Where's Helen? Or the other customers? You hurt anyone? Deuce snorted. We're just talking with people, letting them know the new arrangement. Before anyone could reply, the diner door swung open. Reaper emerged, dragging Helen by her arm. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear. Another biker followed close behind, scanning for threats. Reaper locked eyes with Gunny. You and your buddy have been real thorns in our side. He tightened his grip on Helen, eliciting a small cry of pain. Gunny's heart thundered in his chest, but he kept his composure. "Let her go. This is between us." "Oh, we intend to," Reaper drawled. "After we come to an understanding." Larry stepped forward, fists clenched. "If you've hurt her," Reaper sneered, "she's fine. But I hear you two have been messing with our business. That ends today or more people get hurt." Gunny sensed the slight movement behind him as Parker's team maneuvered into better positions. He raised a calming hand, not wanting a bloodbath. "Let Helen go first and we'll talk." Reaper hesitated, eyes darting from Parker's associates to Gunny. He saw the readiness in their stances, the way their eyes never left him. With a contemptuous snarl, he shoved Helen forward. She stumbled, and Gunny caught her, guiding her gently behind him. Larry pulled her farther back, checking for injuries. Now that Helen was free, the tension ratcheted up. Reaper and Brick moved closer, forming a half-circle with Deuce and the others, cutting off any exit. Gunny planted his feet, exuding calm authority. "We're not letting you shake down this truck stop anymore," Gunny said evenly. "You want to walk away now, no one else gets hurt." Reaper laughed, a harsh bark that turned heads among his men. "You really think you can stand against us? We've got chapters all over the state. You're nothing but a washed-up Marine and a couple of rent-a-cops." Gunny felt the burn of old anger flaring, but he maintained control. "I've faced worse odds." Brick sniggered, cracking his knuckles. Deuce tapped the butt of a knife in his belt. Tension thickened in the humid air. Then, without warning, Reaper lunged forward, a concealed baton swinging toward Gunny's ribs. Gunny twisted, absorbing the impact on his forearm, pain exploding through the limb. Parker's men drew their weapons, but the other bikers moved in a flash, brandishing knives and clubs. A chaotic melee erupted. Larry ducked a wild swing from a biker, countering with a punch to the gut. Parker, stepping from behind the SUV, aimed his sidearm and shouted, "Drop your weapons!" Gunny squared off against Reaper, blocking a second baton strike and retaliating with a palm heel strike to the man's jaw. Reaper staggered but didn't go down, adrenaline fueling him. Brick charged Parker, who was forced to pivot away from a direct shot to avoid hitting one of the truck stop's fuel pumps. The blow from Brick's forearm slammed into Parker's chest, sending him back a step. Parker recovered quickly, driving a knee up into Brick's stomach. Brick gasped, dropping to his knees. Deuce tried to flank Gunny, blade flashing in the sunlight. Helen screamed from behind a pickup truck, unable to tear her gaze away. Gunny parried Deuce's stabbing thrust with a quick sidestep, smashing the man's forearm with a downward strike. The knife clattered on the concrete. Meanwhile, Larry struggled against a hulking biker with a chain wrapped around his wrist. The chain whipped across Larry's forearm, leaving a bright welt. Larry grunted, grabbing the chain and yanking the biker forward, delivering a headbutt that staggered his opponent. Torres and Dowd kept two bikers at bay with drawn pistols, shouting for them to surrender. One biker feigned compliance, then lunged, forcing Torres to fire a warning shot into the air. The crack of gunfire momentarily froze the fight. Reaper seized the distraction, delivering a powerful kick to Gunny's side. Gunny hit the ground hard, gasping as the wind left his lungs. Deuce stepped in, ready to stomp Gunny's head, but Larry intercepted him with a tackle, sending both men sprawling. Gunny forced himself upright, ignoring the pain coursing through his body. Reaper snarled, baton raised high. Gunny rolled aside as it slammed down, the impact denting the asphalt. Summoning what remained of his strength, Gunny drove a punch into Reaper's abdomen, then swung an elbow into the side of his head. Reaper staggered back, disoriented. Parker, having subdued Brick, aimed his gun at Reaper. "Drop it," he barked. Reaper's eyes flicked to the muzzle, calculating. For a moment, it seemed he might comply, But then the roar of more motorcycle engines shattered the air. A second wave of Black Hornets arrived, led by Knox. Knox, still nursing injuries from the previous fight, roared in fury upon seeing his comrades struggling. For new bikers entered the fray, engines revving as they dismounted. Torres and Dowd found themselves pinned behind a row of trucks for cover, exchanging shouts into their radios, calling for backup. Parker cursed under his breath, quickly stepping behind a concrete barrier near the pumps. Gunny knew they were outnumbered. The fresh arrivals rushed forward with unbridled aggression, forcing Parker and his men to retreat further. Larry crawled behind a pickup truck, breath ragged. Knox bellowed, "Finish them off!" Gunny felt a wave of dread. This was quickly spiraling beyond a mere brawl into a full-scale war zone. He frantically scanned the area. Helen was crouched near the diner entrance, trembling. If bullets started flying, she'd be in grave danger. The bikers advanced. Parker and Dowd fired warning shots, but the Hornets pressed on. Gunny exchanged a look with Larry. Both men knew the fight was on the brink of turning lethal. Suddenly, flashing lights appeared at the truck stop's entrance. More patrol cars screeched in, sirens wailing. Deputy Carson emerged, weapon drawn, shouting for everyone to drop their arms. Backup had finally arrived. Chaos exploded. Some bikers panicked, racing back to their motorcycles. Others turned to fight. Carson and his deputies took cover behind their vehicles, yelling commands. Parker's men coordinated with the deputies, picking targets. Knox, furious, swung his meaty fist at Gunny, who barely managed to dodge. The blow grazed his temple, sending stars dancing across his vision. Gunny retaliated with a swift elbow strike to Knox's throat, making him gasp. A deputy tackled a biker who tried to flee, while Carson moved in to subdue Deuce. More shots rang out, hitting the pavement and sending sparks flying. By sheer luck, no one was struck by a bullet. Yet, Gunny spotted Reaper trying to escape, weaving between trucks. Summoning a final burst of energy, Gunny sprinted after him. Reaper vaulted onto a parked motorcycle, but Gunny grabbed his vest, yanking him off before he could accelerate. The bike toppled, engine revving aimlessly. They crashed to the ground. Reaper slashed at Gunny with a hidden blade, slicing into his shoulder. Gunny hissed in pain, clasping Reaper's wrist and twisting it until the blade dropped. With his other hand, Gunny delivered a punishing strike to Reaper's jaw, rendering him unconscious. At last, the combined forces of the deputies and Parker's men overwhelmed the bikers. Brick, Deuce, Knox, and the newcomers found themselves surrounded, forced to their knees. Sirens and shouts melded into an echoing cacophony. Gunny knelt on the ground, gasping for air. Blood trickled from the cut on his shoulder. Deputy Carson rushed over, kneeling beside him. "You all right?" Gunny nodded, vision swimming. He glanced around. Helen was safe, trembling in Larry's arms. Parker was speaking calmly to another deputy, holstering his weapon. The Black Hornets were subdued, cuffed, or laying prone on the asphalt. In that moment, a profound sense of relief washed over Gunny. Relief that the truck stop might finally be free from terror, that the people he'd chosen to protect might finally breathe again without fear. Yet, a subtle unease lingered. The knowledge that gangs like the Black Hornets rarely vanished overnight haunted Gunny's thoughts. He'd won this battle, but the war on America's highways, against predators, corruption, and indifference, was far from over. A quiet question nagged at him. Would he ever truly escape the fight, or was he forever fated to be a sentinel, guarding lonely roads against those who preyed on the innocent? As he stood in the truck stop parking lot one final time, the sun setting over Interstate 40 in streaks of orange and pink, Gunny exhaled a long breath. For now, at least, he could savor the peace earned through sacrifice and grit. But in the distance, motorcycles still rumbled across the great expanse of America's highways, and Gunny remained ever vigilant, ready to meet the next threat, however old or new it might be.